Well, welcome to the Entangled NIME session, a session which we were all waiting for, as it references the topic of this year's NIME, and a topic which many of us are constantly encountering in our work. Without further ado, because we're gonna keep the time in this session, I would want to introduce Entangling with Light and Shadow, Layers of Interaction with the Pattern Organ by Jasmine Butt, Benedict Gaster, Renney, and Maisie Palmer. And I apologize for mispronunciations.
Bro. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Jasmine Butt, and I am presenting a paper called Entangling with Light and Shadow, which is about layers of interaction with the pattern organ, a camera-based synthesizer. And my co-authors are Benedict Gaster, Renney, and Maisie Palmer, and we're all operating out of the Expressive Computer Interactions Research Lab at UE in Bristol. Sorry, complicated setup. So just to jump straight in with the entanglement theme, Frauenberger in 2019 wrote a Tokai article called Entanglement HCI, the Next Wave, in an effort to sort of sketch out a roadmap for designers to start to think about their own work within an entanglement paradigm. And this was particularly interesting to musical instrument designers who are beginning to sort of question the boundaries and the binaries that have been built up in their field over time, particularly in Western discourse, such as the kind of enacted and drawn boundaries between the mind and the body, or the human and the instrument. Oh, hang on one sec there. Or the parts of the instrument itself, like the mapping space, the interface, the sound engine. So around the time of this article, and increasingly since it was written, there's been this lively discourse around kind of post-humanist theories and materialist theories within NIME and other music technology communities. And this paper kind of aims to be make a theoretical contribution to these discussions, particularly looking through the lens of just interactions with one instrument, which is the pattern organ. So in my own wider practice that's kind of shaping this research, I'm really interested in analog optical sound and sort of practices of subverting the analog optical soundtrack on film. So the way that experimental filmmakers use a variety of different material processes using objects and machines and environments to synthesize sound. And these practices have inspired the development of an instrument called the pattern organ, which has been used as a kind of thinking tool to explore entangled interactions in this paper. So we're asking, in what ways can an optical synthesizer reveal entangled dynamics and sonic interaction? And in this paper, we'll present sort of some ongoing thinking about the design developments, as well as observations from workshops and material experiments. So in really simple terms, the pattern organ is a camera-based synthesizer, and it's a PD patch on a Raspberry Pi that takes a variation of luminance through a live camera input and averages it into a kind of high-resolution wavetable. So it's a kind of harmonic drone. And it was deliberately designed with kind of minimal mappings to be able to tune into sort of complex material complexities in its environment and sort of patterns of light. And it was developed in tandem with these workshops. So the kind of observations that came out of the workshops and experiments fed into the design process. And there were two quite significant changes to the interface. So you can see on the left here, the original design was a sort of intended as a digital metaphor for analog optical sounds. There was a sort of skeuomorphic, like a sprocketed paper mechanism as a stand-in for analog film. And there was a fixed camera, so it's kind of top down. And we did away with this idea of the digital metaphor, kind of opting for a more reconfigurable a sort of assemblage of parts that could really lean into some of the interesting behaviors of the digital system. And the other quite important choice that we made was the use of a manual lens camera, So you could kind of sculpt the sound with the zoom and the aperture and the focus, which I'll just show you here. I'm hoping you can hear that sound because it's very quiet to me. But so you can also see this kind of adjustable margin control. So we ran multiple workshops in community settings and in conferences last year. And there were two that were part of a formal study. And the first was at Pre-Chi at UE, Bristol. The second was last year's NIME at Utrecht. And participants were asked to explore these kind of prompt cards and materials that were in the room. And the prompt cards were had words written on them like fold, sample, saturate, words that were deliberately chosen to be kind of ambiguous as to whether they were describing material behaviors or visual patterns or kind of sonic waveforms. And the participants were asked to choose some of these words and find materials and see if they could sort of find ways of interacting with the instrument that related to these words. They were also asked to sort of explore the materials in a more sort of free-form, loose ways, kind of just seeing what kind of sounds and visuals they could get out of them. So out of these workshops, we came up with 5 observations. We kind of transcribed and engaged in time stamping and sort of lots of discussions around some of the things that were said and done in the workshops. And we worked towards a kind of loosely structured qualitative analysis, building towards a diffractive analysis where we were exploring differences as well as similarities between the things that were happening in parts of the workshops and both of the workshops together. So out of this, we kind of came up with 5 overlapping observations, which I'll go through quite quickly for the sake of time. So the first one is around this ambiguity and sustained interactions. So as these kind of patterns, layers and layers of different patterns built up with transparencies and pattern carpets and light sources and shadows, there was this kind of ongoing sense of like what's caused that change in the sound or in the visual. And that prompted sort of ongoing exploration. So participants were kind of suspended in the interaction and they were self-sustaining. And in these more complex kind of layered interactions with the sound, we really noticed that people were kind of tuning in and out of different parts of these patterns. So sometimes they would look through the transparencies or look through the patterns, ignore them completely or not notice them. And other times they would kind of notice and tune in. So this is a really nice example where one of the participants noticed that the ceiling tiles were kind of having an impact on the sound, and they said there's a drone underneath us. So they got someone to sort of turn the light off and then twisted the camera to line up with the tiles to kind of make it more of a solid part of the audio output. And we really noticed that when people were using these prompt cards with specific intentions of how the materials should behave or how they kind of expected them to behave and entangle with the instrument, most of these interactions were kind of marked with disappointment, where people would hit up against the limits of these kind of entanglements, of the limits of the instrument, and just cut so the interaction was kind of sort of stopped dead in its tracks. And there were quite a few examples of this where people were exploring distortion, but there was a specific kind of intention or expectation that kind of stopped the interaction. Even though there might have been interesting behaviors happening, there wasn't really room to kind of lean into these other sort of, interesting entanglements. Another thing that we realized was that the kind of parametric control of the instrument, there wasn't this kind of separation of parameters. So if you think about a camera lens, how you have the zoom and the aperture and the focus, on more affordable lenses, maybe the expensive ones don't do it, but if you change the zoom or the focus, you kind of have, or the aperture, you have an effect on the other two. So these parameters are entangled, they're not separate, and they're working together. And we really found this, I mean, changing the camera lens with a sonic output kind of really tunes you into that fact. But we found that this kind of spectral entanglements were happening with materials as well. So this is a really nice example of a participant who made this lattice work. And there's kind of all of these, the action of sort of stretching and twisting and moving it was having these kind of multiple parametric controls on the sound. So there was kind of pulse width changes and wave folding and sort of harmonic, perceived pitch changes, all kind of embedded in one material. So another one was the interactions that were kind of studied with tons of discovery and experiments were ones where there was some level of automation, be it with the use of kind of motors or feedback or rolling shutter effects. So ones where participants could step in and out of the interaction, and also ones where there was this kind of exploration of some of the hidden inner architecture of the system. So this is a really nice example where we were exploring feedback between two pattern organs, and there was sort of lots of experimentation of making these apertures for tiny light impulses, exploring how to trigger the oscillation and stop it, turning lights on and off. So also kind of exploring the light sensitivity of the camera, how you could flood it to stop the oscillation, or the way that the latencies of the two systems were kind of creating this undulating rhythm. So out of these 5 observations, we then engaged in some more kind of focused material experiments in the studio with salvaged cans found in the studio, sand and torchlight. And we found that each of them kind of unfolded in really different directions. So the salvaged cans made us think of this kind of innate visual rhythm. We put them on a motor, and there's this kind of visual rhythm of commercial product design, and also kind of wear and tear, material history, these kind of crumpled reflections. The sand made us think of this composite sounds of tools and materials, how action and kind of the trace of it can be coupled in sound. And we were using torch with the sand, so that prompted the next experiment, looking into sort of temporal probes and rolling shutter effects, how you can reveal these hidden system behaviors and sort of find out the refresh rate of the torch and the frame rate of the instrument and how they interact. So all of these, the design development, the kind of observations from the workshops have made us think and really consider this idea of enabling material drift, considering how we can decenter the human and think about influence rather than control, and building instruments that kind of make room for tuning into different complex material entanglements outside of the system enclosure, and kind of stepping back, allowing human intention to step back and not out of the frame completely, but just understanding that it's sharing that with other kind of objects, non-humans, and the wider environment. And yes. It's also made us think about fluid assemblages and complexity, how we can understand the kind of lively and unstable edges of our instruments, and understand that in different environments, the instrument becomes a different instrument. And also this idea of powerful actors, how we can recognize the potential powerful actors in the kind of parts of the assemblage. So a good example is we realized that the initial prototype design had the camera acting as a kind of transparent window where the input could come in. and in kind of changing the kind of giving it more agency and using a manual lens and allowing the angle to change, it became a really powerful sort of characterful part of the instrument. So I'll end on another Frauenberger quote, and I will maybe do this. So yeah, Frauenberger said, in order to kind of deepen our understanding of the mutual dependence between humans and objects, we might design hybrid things with ambiguous boundaries and propose programs of actions. So I will end on that quote, but also I'll say, speaking of hybrid things, if anyone was interested in exploring this kind of visual harmonics as an input for different kinds of synthesis, please get in touch. The PD patch is in the link in the paper. So yeah, if you have ideas for that, get in touch, and I'd love to hear from you. So thanks very much.
So we've got time for a few questions. Anyone has any questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much for the presentation. Bear with me when I cope with the terribly disruptive echo. It's brain scrambling in a way that you don't really appreciate until you start talking into the cube. My goodness.
Is that from me? I'm very sorry.
Entirely on this side, there's nothing anybody can do about it except
okay.
bear with it. Really great to see you guys explore. Oh, plug my ears. That's a good idea. Really great to see you guys exploring a system in such depth and looking at it from so many different perspectives and really trying to find all of the various things that can be done with it. I'm really curious to hear what you are thinking about as future work with this system.
There's so many ideas. We've actually also written a paper for audio mostly, which is coming out next week, around sort of composing this kind of materialist approach to composition using the same instrument. And so that was kind of future work for this paper, but it happened quite quickly. So that was kind of looking into bricolage practices and this idea of the 4 E's theory of cognition, so kind of distributed cognition, which we're kind of leaning into more in our future work. But yeah, like I said at the end, I'm really interested in how these kind of higher resolutions of control and kind of input can maybe be used to explore different kinds of synthesis as an input. So that's something that I'm really interested in as well.
We got time for a short question, and maybe Nicole can get ready. Oh, who is next?
And thanks for this really interesting talk. My turn with latency. You talk about control there in terms of going from, I guess, visual to audio, and you have certain kinds of representations that the camera makes. Certain ways that you're theorizing sound, I guess, in your mapping, in your synthesis. How were you balancing these notions of sort of more traditional notions of NIME control, sort of music theory, theory of sound, versus this more exploratory approach? And would you think about actually kind of re-engineering how the camera works, how the mapping works, and this kind of thing, as a result of what you learned from exploring these materials? I don't know if you
That's a really interesting question, and one I might have to think about. But I'm interested in whether you had ideas of how the camera could be re-engineered to sort of change this notion of control. Because I think we were kind of leaning. It's an ongoing development. We were kind of leaning into this idea of how the camera could kind of become, have a little more agency in the process. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear your ideas, because I feel like you might have had a couple.
I don't know if my ideas are really good, but cameras encode this notion of X and Y, right? You have sort of like, here's your horizontal, here's your vertical, here's the brightness or color of each of the pixels. And I guess there's no particular reason that you need to take that form of representation of an image what if you rotate it on its axes? What if you transform it in different geometric ways? I suppose you could literally hack the camera and glitch out the sensor in some way.
That's an idea that I'm really, really fascinated by, and I'm kind of really interested in how that might happen optically on the other side of the camera, but I'd not considered hacking the camera itself. But yeah, in my wider research around sort of analog practices and this experimental film, people have done so much work with creating these kind of apertures and playing with the really odd sort of diffractive behaviors of light in order to kind of expose light onto the film in different ways, using kind of strange lenses and kind of prisms and things like that. So that's something that really fascinates me in terms of what those kinds of optical diffractions might then be able to do to the sound. But I guess I've been thinking more in terms of the other side of the camera, using light and shadow sort of outside. But yeah, hacking the camera would make it a lot more neat and tidy for sure.
Oh, thank you very much, Jasmine. We will move now to the next presentation.
Sure. Thank you. Bye.
We now have Deconstructing Timbre at NIME, Reflecting on Technology and Aesthetic Entanglements in Instrument Design by Charalampos, Saitis, Courtney and Reed, Ashley, Laurent, Noel-Hirst, Giacomo, and Andrew McPherson.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. Can you hear me and see the slides well?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. All right. So here we go. So I'll be talking about some reflections we've been doing on technology and understanding entanglements in NIME and more generally in DMIs and musical interaction, with a focus in this talk about timbre. Why NIME, you might ask? Why are we looking at NIME in this particular topic? NIME is a very interesting academic, predominantly community between music, engineering, and human-computer interaction. A maker in the NIME sort of milieu is many things. It could be a designer or a builder or a performer, a composer, a live coder, etc. As such, they act as creative and critical users of tools, computational tools, but also physical, whose practice has the potential to reveal new insights and understandings about the world in which we live. And that's where timbre comes in. Often relevant in designing a digital instruments are timbre, the sound, pitch, there's going to be maybe some sort of note events or something, and then some rhythm, some timing between the different notes or events. Compared with pitch and rhythm, though, timbre is neither easy to define or discretize when we negotiate different audio representations and how to map gestures and sound. It's a concept that is very notorious for its ambiguity. The story begins somewhere in the 17th, 18th century, 18th, 19th century with the introduction of the term, actually, as a third musical attribute. In reality, of course, people were talking, like musical discourse was about timbre. We just didn't use the term. People were using more metaphors and other types of vocabulary of language to describe something that is not pitch, it's not loudness, it's not duration, it's something else. And eventually we arrived in the 20th century in the American National Standards Institute definition of timbre as something that is not pitch or loudness, which of course is a definition by negation, and it sort of shows the challenge, the historical challenge of positively defining what timbre is. And that's where we eventually also arrived at timbre being described as a sonic waste basket. Maybe some of you in the audience are familiar with this term. If not, it's the idea that, anything that we somehow can't explain about the particular character quality of a sound, we just throw it in that basket, and we call it overall as timbre. So this has been, of course, a very useful definition. It's good to have some sort of formal definition about something, but is it actually, or has it ended up constraining things? And this is what we set up to explore. Barriere, for instance, positions timbre as a critical point of aesthetical and philosophical divergence. He describes that as an inevitable breaking point in musical discourse, where different conceptualizations of timbre represent opposed musical ideas and aesthetical positions. Following a line of similar ideas, Michel Chion went as far as to basically call for the dissolution of timbre. We don't need it. Let's get rid of it. And in a way, as we will close this talk, maybe that's not a bad idea. Luckily, though, so far this hasn't happened. Luckily for many reasons, but also for my work. And specifically now about NIME, though, the problem that timbre is ambiguous and underspecified might also be symptomatic of a broader difficulty to talk about musical aesthetics. After all, it is much easier to talk about control structures, and we will see right now why that is. So one of the first attempts to instrumentalize timbre space came by David Bessel. So for those of you that might not be familiar with what we call timbre space, essentially in the 70s, thanks to digital technology, digital synthesis, researchers were able to synthesize stimuli that had a specific configuration. People would rate similarity between different stimuli, and then there were some computational tools through which you could take those dissimilarity ratings and turn them into a timbre space, a geometrical representation. Through digital signal processing advancements at the same time, it gradually became possible to extract audio features from the signals and correlate them with the dimensions of the timbre space. And that eventually led to a whole infrastructure, as Landon Morrison calls it, of representations, audio features, etc., from signals that underpins a lot of modern, if not all modern music technology recommendation systems, the MPG standard, and so on. So it's interesting how Morrison traces this, a lot of the technology we're using today back to this idea of having something that is supposedly a perceptual dimension, and then an audio signal, an audio feature extracted from a signal correlating to that. So Bessel was interested in how these descriptive correlations between audio features and listeners' perceptions could be turned into a prescriptive and interactive musical control structure that would allow musicians to measure, navigate, and create new timbres. And this has really dominated the NIME discourse ever since, and not only the NIME discourse. It extends to ISMIR and to the broader music technology, music computing communities. Now, this points to some sort of representationalism, right? So timbre is a pre-existing sonic property that can be controlled. We highlight this. We neither endorse nor reject the representationalism that is widely found in the sciences. However, we want to also highlight recent critical discourse in NIME and the broader HCI community about how representationalism eventually seeks universal definitions that apply to entire communities, but we might want instead to attend to specificities and effects of difference. And that's what Barrett's agential realism posits. If we look into this more relational approach, timbre emerges through the act of music making itself, through the entanglement of everything that is at the core of producing a sound, making a sound. It's the audience, it's the musician themselves, it's the instrument, it's the space, it's everything. And this echoes something that Dana Cooley wrote a while ago, that instrumental timbres are the product of an encounter between a person and a technology. So our main then question was, considering all the background, how is timbre constructed in the NIME literature? So we conducted a corpus-assisted discourse analysis on the whole NIME corpus, plus ICMC for comparison reasons, and I'll explain that in a bit. We ended up analyzing 2,132 papers, and the first thing we looked at is, how key is timbre at NIME? So we looked at keyness analysis, comparing the timbre corpus with a much larger reference corpus, and looking at the G-square threshold. So as you can see from this graph, timbre is a key, is an important term in NIME, is a keyword in the sort of pure statistical sense of the term. But it is, of course, much less than pitch or mapping or gesture. So we are using these other words as kind of comparisons or anchors. So music is more of a, we wanted to see that indeed music is a 100%, let's say, keyword in NIME. And we look at gesture and mapping as key terms in the community, following up recent work, critical work on these terms as well. And we don't want to suggest that pitch is a well-defined concept, like perhaps, in fact, none of these concepts is well-defined. So that's not only a problem of timbre, but we focus on timbre, and while we do that, its ambiguity connects to a broader pattern of technology and aesthetic entanglements. We then looked at keyword occurrence, comparing again across these terms, and timbre is the least frequently occurring of the terms, and that prompted us to think, and pitch appears much more often, like approximately 1.6 times more. So that prompted us to think, are we looking at some sort of claviocentrism, and the hegemony of the keyboard interaction paradigm that eventually points more to talking about individual notes and hence pitch. The titles say a slightly different story. Timbre here is almost, or more in the case of ICMC, frequent than pitch. So we also looked at ICMC both in the same period as NIME or also extending all the way back to 75. And there it's even a bit better. What we haven't done yet, and it's future work, is actually do the keyword occurrence in the body of ICMC, plus the analysis that I'm going to talk about in a bit. So possibly, it's possible that we have different ways of talking about timbre. Maybe people don't even use the word timbre, and that's why it doesn't appear as often as pitch. And that again goes back to our broad position that timbre is many things to many people and has many functions. We then concluded with a collocation and concordance analysis. So basically looking at, the word timbre in the corpus and what words come around it in the whole corpus, but also in a subcorpus of 18 papers that explicitly mention timbre on their title. And we found some interesting things, confirming and extending results that we reported last year in audio mostly. So most NIMEs use audio features to analyze and manipulate timbre, reflecting a particular techno-scientific understanding of it. Choice of tools informs timbre negotiation, and this echoes a bit findings from a survey with instrument makers about being pragmatists and influenced of their environment. It points to a discourse about materiality of models, data, and MIR approaches. And we also noted that NIMEs, there is a preoccupation in NIME with timbre as something to be controlled. And if we go back to Cornelia Thales, this works directly contrary to the efforts of perceptualization that are necessary to support timbre as something to be explored. So even though we kept seeing the words controlling and exploring, we think that this is actually a tension rather than two terms that mean the same thing. So here we are faced with a proper socio-technical construction. We describe timbre via audio features. These become proxies for timbre, and eventually part of the reification of timbre, and description becomes prescription. And this is a risk about NIME, and it shows that NIME is suspended in this tension between techno-scientific and constructivist approaches. So we must acknowledge that the NIME's conceptualization of timbre is indeed a construction of the digital age. Through our analysis, we identified 6 such tensions and contradictions of epistemological and methodological tension, or paradoxes of timbre, as are also known. And we invite the NIME community to further explore how particular aspects of these tensions might be encoded in our tools and practices, and what they instruct users, the musicians, the audiences, the scholars, the engineers, to value. So timbre can be static or dynamic, static as in terms of representationalism, or dynamic as something that emerges from an interaction between humans and computers. It could be categorical, or it could be something more continuous in our listening experience. Controlled or explored, features versus more about identity, ascribed, as for instance, with audio features, we ascribe certain qualities to timbre, or it could be something generated like in physical modeling synthesis. And finally, there is the differences in perception by humans and machines. So we suggest NIME to utilize these paradoxes and explore timbre through personal, situated, and entangled knowledge. Finally, to provoke a little bit further, so if timbre is actually a thing, because maybe it isn't, that exists, then what form does it exist in? Is it a static? Is it a fixed property of sound? Or is it something that indeed emerges from human-computer interaction? And if we remove the digital from timbre's conceptualization in NIME, does timbre then survive in this form? We don't have an answer, and maybe that's not the whole point, but we wish to sparkle a conversation around these ideas and how this can influence both research in NIME and also in timbre across other disciplines. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charalampos. While Nicole sets up, maybe we have time for a quick question, but it has to be brief, unfortunately. Anyone? Otherwise, I do have a question. Oh, sorry, I'm in the middle. I will ask the question then. I completely agree that uncritically subscribing to this features proxy of Timbre definitions is unproductive, and that it often lacks a critical approach of at least just reflecting on the terminology certain papers are using and why are they doing that. It would be great if at least the section was included in some papers to engage with these questions, but I wonder if that is enough. And you propose this series of tensions that go very much in this direction of steering the actual practical implementation of technologies in NIME that engage with Timbre. But I was wondering if you could talk about some projects. It has to be brief, unfortunately, but of your students who are engaging with these questions, and how are you putting these tensions into practice? Like, how are you designing with this whole critical idea?
Yes, thank you for the question. As a matter of fact, there is another paper in NIME this year with one of my students and one of the collaborators from this paper now, where what happens is that there is an extended conversation and co-construction of timbre and audio features between a scientist, technologist, and somebody who is a performer, a practitioner. And there has been very interesting insights there as to, for instance, how the artist wants to work with some audio features and what they might be able to do with them, and how they try to translate their artistic ideas into, honed down to one or a few specific audio features. And then there is the scientist who tries to formalize that and think of, more scientific, technological questions around it. We also had a hackathon a year ago. So that's the Audio Mostly 2024 paper, where we basically had this idea of inviting mostly audio developers, audio technologists, not makers, to design a timbre tool for an instrument maker. Of course, that's a very vague idea, but there we were able to see again how people with perhaps different notions of timbre eventually came together in a team in a very specified, short amount of time to create something around a shared notion. They had to negotiate timbre and so on. And we're also now developing a follow-up on that that incorporates some of the findings from the paper I just presented.
Thank you very much, Haris. Can we give an applause, please? So next we have negotiating entanglements in the composition and curation of an ultrasonic art installation by Nicole, Robson, Andrew McPherson, and Nick Bryan-Kinns.
Hi everyone, my name is Nicole Robson and I'll be presenting this paper today that Teresa so beautifully introduced on behalf of my co-authors Andrew McPherson and Nick Bryan-Kinns. Okay. So the central idea of this paper is to examine the process of creating a sound installation called sonographies. And we characterise that process as a negotiation because the project was guided both by artistic intention to create certain aesthetic effects and to foreground embodied modes of experience, while also working to decenter human agency and allow the non-human agencies of the technology and of the gallery to inform creative direction. And this negotiation is explored through first-person documentation, using research through design methods to articulate its twists and turns. So I'd like to begin by sharing this quote by the sound art scholar Brandon Lebel, for whom they characterise sound as a material as intrinsically and unignorably relational, propagates, vibrates, communicates, and affects, Sound is entangled with the material and acoustic properties of place, and with the bodies and perceptual activities of those who listen. It's hardly surprising, then, that entanglement theories have been adopted across the fields of sound studies, musicology, and now NIME. In our paper, we draw specifically on Karen Barrad's agential realism, though other entanglement theories are available, which posits a radically relational view of reality, not as consisting of discrete subjects and objects, but as phenomena that is co-produced through the dynamic interactions or interactions of matter and meaning. Importantly there, agency is not an exclusive property of humans, but enacted across human and non-human configurations. And given that we're using first-person methods in our study, I feel it wise to kind of address this epistemological tension for how can we create knowledge from anything but a human perspective. And so in our paper, we temper Barrad's posthumanism by advocating for an embodied perspective that could interface human subjectivity and the material world. And we're inspired here by both design practices from the field of HCI, particularly within more than human design, such as the acts of decentering and also designing with non-human agencies. But also importantly, installation practices from the sound art tradition are a key influence on this work. And perhaps unlike a lot of the interactive sound installations that are presented at NIME, within this tradition, sound installations are considered inherently site-specific. Because if we take a relational view of sound, as I described at the beginning of this presentation, then if we put speakers into a space, then we have to acknowledge that the sound of the composition is also being shaped by the acoustics of that place. And so artists working in this tradition seek to harness and work with the materiality of a space to shape the installation itself. And in a set of interviews that we conducted with artists a few years ago, it was described as a process of kind of bringing together or assembling these different agencies from the ground up, rather than imposing artistic agency on the work. So I'll next move on to talk about the installation sonographies, and this is the second artwork that has been created with an ultrasonic installation technology. It was first described in a NIME paper in 2022. And I direct you to that paper for technical details, which I'll just briefly describe here. So essentially, a multi-channel composition is composed in the audible range, and then each channel is shifted into the ultrasonic domain using amplitude modulation before being output to a tweeter in the installation space. And so the piece itself is sounding physically in the gallery, but above the range of human hearing. And listeners wear these special devices that we've developed with microphones on the outside of the headphone ear cups that capture sonic phenomena, the ultrasonic phenomena, route the audio signals to a teensy microcontroller where they are shifted into audibility by the same processes of amplitude modulation. And the original composition really retains a lot of the same kind of audio fidelity, but these processes of modulation utterly alter the kind of spatial appearance of sound, and importantly lead to the Doppler effect becoming exaggerated, such that sounds bend and shift with the movement of a listener. And this is something that we've described in our other past NIME paper as a kind of interaction without sensors. The artwork sonographies was guided by the particular artistic intention to emphasize these intimate and relational qualities of interaction through both the sonic composition and through the curation of the piece, which was done in collaboration with Eva Martinez, a dance dramaturg and art curator. And before I move on to talk about the study, I'll share a couple of short excerpts. So the first one here is intended as a sparse domestic interior. and the second excerpt more of what I call a kind of intimate sonic soup. So I now turn to the study that is reported on in the paper, which sought to address this research question. How do non-human material influences shape my artistic practice and process with the ultrasonic installation? Sonographies was developed during a month-long creative residency at No Format Gallery in London, and I report this as a design journey, a reconstructed account of the process from contemporaneous notes and meeting recordings with Eva, all while reflecting on the direction and decisions taken to elicit insights. And this journey consists of 4 design events, each of which offer insights into the interplay of human intention and non-human material forces. The design journey is written in the first person present tense, and I'll shift to that voice now, quoting key parts of the paper. I spend the first day of the residency looking, listening, singing, making sketches, and writing notes. I'm struck by how different No Format Gallery is from previous venues, which were dark spaces with dry acoustics and heavy doors that isolated the installation from the outside world. By contrast, this space is pleasingly reverberant, filled with light and acoustically porous. The external environment spills into the space and demands my attention, creating a relationship with the outside world that hasn't existed before. I hear cars passing, people talking as they pass by, the sounds of sirens, aeroplanes, and the clatter of construction. The next day, I set up the installation and listened to different sound materials in situ, new recordings made for sonographies, and simple materials such as sine tones and string drones used previously. The sounds feel underwhelming in this space, lost, lacking impact. The close and warm reverberance of the gallery does not translate to headphone listening. It's audible only as hissy, high-frequency transients. And due to the reflective surfaces, the spatial profile of the installation seems poorly defined. Unable to draw on past understanding, I doubt my ability to compose with the technology. Seeking to advance the sound design and dispel feelings of discomfort and uncertainty, I adopt compositional strategies that I've used in past site-specific musical work. I generate a list of resonant frequencies based on the room's dimensions and play these out into the installation as sine tones, which I find reassuring but also somewhat arbitrary, as they're not actually triggering room acoustics, as they would if played out audibly. I also record an impulse response using the sine sweep method. If I add convolution reverb to a track, I wonder whether this should be applied to just that related tweeter or exist in the installation globally. Would these effects and their connection to the gallery even be discernible to a listener visiting the space for the first time? I persevere for some time along this path, experimenting with different sound materials and spatial configurations, but remain dissatisfied. The effects don't seem to advance the project or relate the sound design to the gallery in a meaningful or perceptible manner. During the residency, I also complete upgrades to the hardware, allowing for a cleaner, louder, and more transparent mediation of ultrasonic phenomena. This has a profound impact on the listening experience. The sounding space of the installation audio is vivid and fills perceptual space. Footsteps and the rustle of clothing become more audible, which in combination with richer Doppler effects creates a visceral awareness of my body and spatial situation. Aesthetically, these are desirable effects, and my compositional practice shifts from attending to the gallery and its sonic characteristics towards sound design that supports and emphasizes the effects of mediation in the installation. In the run-up to public exhibition dates, I feel the expectations and conventions of the art gallery context keenly, and curation is a key concern. Eva Martinez invites me to consider the whole experience, how visual, tactile, and linguistic stimuli might coax a listener towards an embodied mode of perception, and how liminal spaces, the entry and the exit, can be held and actively contribute to the artwork. I act on instinct, prioritizing interventions that I believe will be most impactful. A text provocation to listen with headphones, listen with your body, listen with the space, is displayed at the entrance. The windows are covered by long, semi-sheer white curtains, and the space is lit in soft pink. The electronic circuitry is rehoused in an organic form, bringing the object into the aesthetic sphere of the artwork. I reflect that our curatorial interventions had a greater impact on the listening experience than I had initially imagined, creating what Eva calls an intentional space, meaning that the gallery is no longer the background, its materiality contributes meaningfully to the art experience. And while the interventions are subtle, they are intentional and therefore perceived in relation to the sonic. In the paper, we discussed feelings of doubt as connected to the act of decentering human agency, and also reflect on the ambiguous relationship that sonographies has to sight. However, here I'm just going to highlight one of the discussion areas in the paper, and that is how the final installation design aligns aesthetic values with material agencies. So design decisions were always made into the aesthetic register, asking, does this serve or detract from the intended experiential mode? And I find this quotation by Wilkie and Michael really resonates with my orientation to the more than human elements. The intention was to create coherence or an alignment between the sound design, curation, sonic and material qualities of the gallery. So in event 2, where I was trying out site-specific methods, the devices that I developed this way did not cohere with the installation, nor work to produce a cogent event, i.e. one that was compelling or convincing. And yet, then in event 3, where this small tweak to the installation technology really changes the experience of sound and coheres with the desired aesthetic, producing effect that is cogent and compelling. And so in conclusion, our study shed light on how the installation works and how it creates aesthetic meaning as a NIME entangled with the material agencies of sight and technology. I think there are two kind of maybe key takeaways that might be relevant more widely here. Firstly is that we found aesthetics to be an emergent quality of the entire assemblage, i.e. not something that could be mapped or manipulated within the system design, but rather a cumulative effect of compositional practice, curation, technology mediations, and the materiality and sociality of the gallery. And secondly, our experiences highlight the fragility of the installation, that it had to change so much as we moved it from one space to another, and suggest that an attunement to entanglement also implies a sensitivity to flux and change, and a conception of NIMEs as more like events rather than objects. And so finally, we'd like to end with a provocation for NIME to embrace practice research to elicit detailed understandings of musical entanglement from embodied human perspectives. Thank you for listening. I was also just going to say, if anyone wants to listen to the installation, I'm going to set it up tomorrow in the poster session, so just come and find me.
Do we have any questions?
Oh, thanks for that. It was great. I really like that. Just a very simple question, but you talked about this idea of being senseless, or the idea of no senses or listening.
Oh, yeah.
Can you just expand on that a little bit?
That the installation is sensor-free, is that the point?
Yes.
Yeah, so essentially it sort of demonstrates a kind of alternate paradigm, I suppose, one that comes more from this sound art tradition. I've been very interested in how, by placing sound sources in a space, actually the experience of moving through the space can sort of feel interactive. And that's something that I was trying to sort of heighten or exaggerate with this design. So there aren't any sensors detecting your movement and mapping that data to a sonic output. What you hear is your acoustic entanglement with sound in the space, kind of sonified and magnified. So that's what I'm really getting to there. That's the distinction.
Do you perceive the person interacting as being sensitive?
You could say that, yeah. And arguably, you could say that the the microphones are sensors because they're detecting the sound, which is a kind of representation of you in space. That's
changing as you move in the space, isn't that just with the same?
Yeah. So you both have this sort of changing spatial relationship to the different speakers that are placed and sound materials that are in the space. And there's also this sort of movement interaction in the sense that the piece is kind of warping with your movement.
Any other questions? Here? Someone's speaker.
Yeah, I think there are two threads that I'd be interested in you elaborating on. One was the idea of preconceptions and how that changes the way that people embody the experience. So I guess my question around that is, what sort of thinking went into the sort of preconceptions you wanted to give people, and how did you go about doing that? And then the second is just that last idea you had around NIMEs as events, and if you'd like to elaborate on that potentially in connection with preconceptions as well.
Yeah, thank you. So the first one, I by preconceptions, I'm kind of assuming that you mean what is the experience that I wanted people to have, what I was sort of designing for. There've been two iterations of this piece, and the first one, being with the waves, was much more representational. There were voices in it. It sort of directed your attention in different ways. And with this artwork, I really just wanted to focus on the feeling of interaction, on this, trying to heighten and foreground this quality of this very kind of intimate quality of relating with sound in the space, which is hard to put into words, right? It's quite abstract. And that's why I was kind of trying to strip back a lot of the things that I'd done in the first installation. So this was more abstract, I suppose, but the intention was to try and foreground this kind of felt sense, to sort of encourage people to adopt a sort of way, a mode of experiencing the artwork that would help them to attune with that through the use of the text that I mentioned in the presentation. But then also, I suppose, is just kind of drawing on my own kind of intuition and aesthetic feeling as to how that might be achieved in the presentation of the work and in the choice of sound materials. And on the sort of NIMEs as events point, I think this has kind of come up in similar ways in earlier presentations in this session. The idea that some instruments aren't necessarily kind of stable assemblages. They might change if you move them into different places or put them into different communities. And so I suppose I'm just trying to highlight that as a point that might actually come to inform design, and because that's something certainly that I've encountered very strongly working with this particular technology. I move it to a different space and I have to completely reconsider how the design works in relation to the space. So that's maybe a bit more of a kind of open question, but perhaps that begins to address your question.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And can we have an applause for Nicole and the rest of the